There is little debate as to which is the most influential empire in the history of humanity. The Roman Empire, founded in the 1st century BC, will go on to politically and culturally dominate the civilized world for over a millennia, and in many ways its impact is still felt nowadays, over 500 years after its dissolution. But centuries before this unquestionable hegemon would emerge, there was another superpower which dominated the ancient world. The Achaemenid Empire, ruled by a dynasty of Persian kings, spanned over 5.5 million kilometers and ruled over 35 million people during its peak. During the reign of its greatest king, Cyrus the Great, the empire had grown from a regional power in the Middle East into the largest empire on Earth. From the edge of the known world at the Indus Valley to the east, to the shores of the Anatolian Peninsula to the west, the Achaemenids had a seemingly endless number of peoples and cultures under their rule. One of these peoples were the Ionian Greeks of Anatolia, who had migrated into the region from their homelands in continental Europe centuries earlier. The Greeks had come under the domain of the Persians after Cyrus waged war with the Empire of Lydia, incorporating Anatolia into his empire. At the dawn of the 5th century BC, Cyrus had been dead for 3 decades, and another great Persian king ruled the Achaemenid Empire. The details around Darius's ascension to the Persian throne are cloudy and highly speculative, but we know that he was not a direct descendant of Cyrus, and not among his intended successors. It is likely that Darius fabricated a story about his ancestry in order to give himself legitimacy, but in reality did not belong to the Achaemenid dynasty. Nevertheless, Darius proved himself a capable king, albeit for different reasons than Cyrus. Although he continued expanding his domain, Darius's empire management skills were the reason why he was regarded as highly as he was. During his reign, the empire functioned as a collection of highly autonomous satrapies, similar to how the Roman Empire would function several centuries later with its provincial system. Darius knew that if he were to rule an empire of this magnitude with an iron fist, it would eventually turn on itself and fall apart. So the Persians showed a high degree of tolerance and leniency towards their subjects, in the interests of keeping their empire together. The Greeks of Anatolia were governed by the so-called Greek tyrants, rulers of Greek origin who were appointed by and loyal to the Persian king. However, over the years there was more and more resentment from the citizens of Ionia piling up towards their rulers. The appointment of often incapable and power-hungry tyrants made the citizens of the Ionian city-states disillusioned with their current state of affairs. Additionally, the rise of democracy in Athens as a seemingly superior system of governance made their disdain even more prevalent. Eventually, the tyrant of Miletus, the most important and influential city in the region, would use this increasing tension in his favor and incite a rebellion against Persian rule. The details surrounding the events that culminated into the Ionian Revolt are unclear, but in 499 BC, Aristagoras of Miletus led his men alongside the Persians in a campaign against the city of Naxos in the Ionian Sea. The campaign not only concluded unsuccessfully for Aristagoras and the Persians, but the Greek tyrant fell out of favor with the Persian nobility, possibly after getting into a personal feud with a close relative of Darius himself. Fearing the loss of his office as tyrant, and potentially his life, Aristagoras rallied all Greek city-states of Ionia in a rebellion against the Persians. This event is known as the Ionian Revolt. Before meeting the Persians on the battlefield, Aristagoras went on a diplomatic mission in mainland Greece to seek support from his fellow Greeks. The mission was for the most part a failure, with most city-states refusing to take part in the conflict. However, the cities of Athens and Eritrea decided to join Aristagoras and his cause. The Athenians likely felt obliged to join the conflict because of their close cultural ties with the Greeks of Anatolia, and Athens' perceived role as the center of Ionian culture in the Greek world. Thus, 30,000 Athenians and Eritreans set sails to Anatolia to fight the Persians. In the initial stages of the conflict, the Greeks took the initiative by marching on the city of Sardis. Sardis was one of the most important cities in the Persian Empire, and its role as the administrative center of Anatolia made it highly strategically significant. The Persians had not had the chance to retaliate yet. The immense size of the Persian domain often made the mobilization of troops a difficult and lengthy process. For this reason, the rebels were able to take Sardis largely uncontested. As the Greeks were entering the city, a devastating fire broke out and ravaged through it. It is unknown if the fire was purposefully started by the Greeks with the intent of razing the city, or if it was just an unfortunately timed event, but its consequences were devastating for the citizens of Sardis. The Persian response came soon after. The Ionians were defeated in battle, and the Persians slowly started retaking each city that had shown support for the rebellion. This process took Darius 5 years, but in 494 BC, the last pockets of resistance were crushed. Aristagoras managed to escape with his life, but the rebellion did not end without severe consequences for the Ionians. While the Persians were lenient and tolerant towards their subjects, those who raised the banner of revolt had to be punished severely. As the instigator of the rebellion, the city of Miletus was made to serve as an example of what happens to those who dare to defy Persian rule. The city was effectively destroyed, with the majority of its population sold into slavery, marking a decisive defeat for the Ionians. It is highly likely that Darius had his sights set on conquering mainland Greece long before the revolt of Aristagoras. The Persian king already had a foothold in southeastern Europe, with Thrace being under his control and the king of Macedonia being his vassal. Naturally, the next step for Persian expansion was to continue south and subdue the remainder of Greece. The Athenian and Eritrean involvement in the Ionian Revolt gave Darius an easy way to justify such an expedition and effectively served as his casus belli. Persian emissaries were dispatched to all city-states in mainland Greece, demanding their immediate surrender. Fearing retaliation, the majority of Greeks accepted Persian demands, however some refused to do so. Notably, the Persian messengers sent to Athens and Sparta were murdered, as a sign of total defiance towards the Achaemenid Empire. Darius had no other choice but to start preparing an expedition to subdue the hostile Greeks. War was inevitable.